today, if you're here for the first time or you've been you've been gone for whatever reason, we've been doing a sermon series based off of a book written by Rob Bell. What is the Bible? And in his book, he divides it in 4 different parts. And this will be part 4. So in his book, what he does in part 4 is he wrestles with very commonly asked questions about the Bible, and he addresses his own thoughts on that. So we thought it'd be fun to do our own version of that today. So we posted on Facebook online where people could submit questions anonymously. And so today we're going to be wrestling with those questions. So a caveat. Did I say that right? Caveat, whatever. Angie and I are not experts. We built a culture here where hopefully no one sees us as experts, and I think that's pretty clear most of the time. We encourage dialogue, we encourage questions, and actually questions are a part of a robust faith, a healthy faith. And so we allow that space and focus much on what Jacob prayed. Really love at the center and the core is what I think holds us together. So we create space for a lot of different views and beliefs and doctrines, which is very different than a lot of churches that probably most of us have been a part of. So today we're going to wrestle and engage with a list of different questions. We obviously don't have the end-all means of answers to those questions. Throughout the week, if you're a part of our online Facebook community, we'll be posting these questions and allowing you guys to engage in your own thoughts and your own perspectives. You do not have to agree with me or Angie, and you can write your own thoughts in that as long as it's respectful of other people. And so we're going to be doing that also throughout the week. And I wanted to take a note that there are some pretty intense questions, especially towards the end. And if you feel anything within you, kind of this tension rise up, just be aware of that and observe that. I know that happens to me, absolutely, when somebody speaks on things that I hold dear. And so it's just something to note. And we're not here to press that upon you. We're just here to share different perspectives and our ways of thinking about a lot of these questions. So I'm going to go ahead and hand it off to Angie, who's going to give a little introduction as well.
I honestly, this whole thing might not have as much to add because Aaron and I have talked a lot about this. He's written a lot of fantastic information on it. So if there's some questions where I go, what he said, it's because I literally mean that. I would echo those sentiments as well, is that neither of us are experts. And personally, I don't think anyone is because we all have a different lens and different perspective. So it's my hope, I just personally want to say this as a personal disclaimer, it's my hope that no one in this room would feel alienated or judged for their opinions or beliefs. That this is also difficult because even though Aaron and I agree on a lot of things, I know there might be some in this room that don't agree with us on these things. And that can be challenging, and there's some tension in that. So I just want to give you permission to rest in that. And I love that we're opening it up for further dialogue online because I think that is important to continue this discussion and learn from each other and each other's perspectives. So hopefully I don't say anything that hurts you. I will be as respectful as I can. And also I would like to know if there are other questions that we didn't address that you just want to talk about. I would also love to talk about that. If you want to get lunch or coffee and further that discussion, please, let's do so. Okay.
Yeah, sorry, I kind of pulled the table away from you while you were talking.
It's fine. It's okay. You want me to go first?
Sure. Yeah.
Yep. Okay. We're going to dive in. We've got quite a bit of questions, but the first one I'll jump in is, how is it that when I read the Bible, I can only see scripture that commands us to love each other, yet someone else can read the same exact Bible and use it to despise the actions of his fellow man? 1 Corinthians used to be pretty clear to me growing up. It sets the foundation for what I believe the Lord wants us to strive for. I mean, it concludes by stating, and now these 3 remain, faith, hope, and love, but the greatest of these is love. I took a lot of shots in the head growing up, but even when I clearly deduce that the Father is telling us that we need to love each other, that wasn't on there, but that was part of the further question. In other words, this person really wrestled with this. And then the next question.
All right, so next slide. What we did here is we grouped some of these together because they're similar themes. So we're just going to read through 4 questions real quick, and then we'll engage. Does the Bible have a bright line in sin? I'm asking because there was conduct years ago that bothered my conscience and no longer does. I'm wondering if it really can be depended on as a standard of conduct. Can we agree to treat each other with love as a standard? Good question.
Yeah, great question. What do you think the Bible says are the real rules? I actually believe there's a black and white when it comes to many things. Not as excessive as everything in the Bible, but generally thinking loving God above all others and your neighbor is, or I think they mean as yourself, is an idea behind the thinking we should have about guidelines. I guess I want to hear more applicable rules you guys might be seeing. Where are do's and this and don'ts? I'd love to hear your guys' take on what it looks like Jesus has hard no's on.
And last question here. That was a good one again. I believe that the Bible is God's love letter to me, a phrase that I'm borrowing from one of my previous pastors. It illustrates the importance of God caring and mercy for us, his gift of Jesus, and that we should care for each other. But the same former church of mine believed that the Bible had an answer for how I was to think and act most times. I don't believe this anymore. Today I believe that I can see how the Bible showed principles of living in the past, and I can decide how that applies today. Do you agree?
Okay, so there we have our first 4 questions. Wow, this is not easy, y'all. Well, first of all, what we're going to do is kind of lump those first 4 questions together. There's kind of an overarching theme there, that when we're talking about all these questions, we're really talking about a much larger theme, which is really how do we interpret the Bible, right? Because whether we talk about it being a love letter or what are the rules or do's and don'ts, we're really talking about interpretation and personal interpretation. And obviously, in a world where there's over 33,000 Protestant denominations, we can clearly see that humanity doesn't agree on everything, right? We interpret things very differently. So when we talk about interpreting the Bible, I think we ought to pause and focus on the word interpret for a minute. And you know me, I love words. I've said this before, but I would have been an English teacher if I wasn't so obsessed with art. Interpret really has 2 definitions. I want you to pay attention. This, I thought it was so helpful and insightful for me. That interpret is not only how we understand something and give meaning to it, but interpret is also how we explain or translate something. So the thing that's vital to take note of is that when we interpret something, we are not only gathering what is this for me and my life? What does this mean? But often when we interpret it, that means we're translating it to somebody else. So we may take a view and a lens of Scripture, and we go, yes, this has meaning. And oftentimes it doesn't end there. It continues on with how we translate to others, right? And I think that is how we start to get all sorts of lenses and different perspectives. It means one thing to me, and then therefore I tell someone else. And I think it really highlights our different perspectives. It really showcases we have a lot of different perspectives. The thing we have to keep in mind that people don't want to admit, a lot of times the tradition I was raised in is the Bible says what it says. The problem is we are reading the Bible. We don't actually have the Bible talking, saying, this is what I mean literally, right? We have our own preconceived ideas and biases. This is important. Mm-hmm. So if you come from a certain background and maybe you have experienced violence and abuse, you are going to read the Bible in a lot of portions as violent and abusive. If you have come from a perspective where God is the end-all, be-all, that says it, you're going to probably read that, right? We cannot help but project our lives and our stories into it. It's just the way it is. The thing I want to hinge on, though, is that interpreting isn't just an internal process. It's also an external process. And I think that's important. So we read it personally, we reflect, but then we discuss and we dialogue. If we're following that word interpret, that's what that means. It's twofold. It's how does this reflect and mean, what does this mean to me, but also I'm now going to translate and talk to you, but that means you're going to do the same. And I think where we get this wrong sometimes is where we take our lens and we hinge on that and we interpret it to others and force it on them as truth. I think that's where we can get things skewed. This is how it meant for me, so now this is my truth, this is your truth, and this is the way it has to be. So I think everyone in the room is probably guilty of this. There's probably a lot of people going, yes, I have done this. Yes, we have done this in our lives. I probably still do this. I try not to, but I probably still do. And I think the modern church is certainly guilty of this. Certainly guilty of this. So when it comes to our views of hard no's or yeses, like that question asked, I think we ought to tread a little lightly, because we have often wrapped the Bible in certainty and then just labeled it God. So maybe we tread a little lightly and say, let's give room for dialogue on what that is revealing to us. I'll leave you with this final quote, because I don't know how long these questions are going to take, but we'll see if we can get through them. It's a quote by Mike McHargue, and if you don't know who he is, I encourage you actually to get his book called Finding God in the Waves. He has a podcast, he's with the liturgists, he's got a lot of really amazing things, but his story is so powerful. And he says, what if the Bible isn't God's letter to humanity at all? Okay, so that might be heresy, but I'm throwing it out there. What if the Bible isn't God's letter to humanity at all? What if the Bible is something that people wrote in response to God? The Bible is as much a reflection of us as it is of God. The Bible's inspiration and divinity comes when we, the people of God, study it together. We challenge it as it challenges us, and in doing so, challenge each other.
So good. Yeah, I guess I'll just piggyback off that a little bit. I would be cautious to use the language of God. The Bible is God's love letter to us. I understand behind that, and I guess I'm cautious of that because the assumptions behind that could easily be like God wrote the Bible directly to us. And really, when we start, this gets to the undergird, what is the Bible? It was written by people. I don't think any of the authors ever imagined that there would be like a whole book to put together that 2,000, 3,000 years later people would be reading. And so it's important for us to remember this isn't written for us from God. This is written by people, I think, as they experienced and struggled with questions about who God was. So that helps a little bit. So just being cautious of that word. Although I still think that we can uncover God's love in that for us as individuals and collectively as a whole. So as far as do's and don'ts, this is a tough one because the person who asked this obviously believed there are some clear do's and don'ts, which I would agree. I think there are some clear do's and don'ts, but I don't think there's very many. I think what I see when I read Jesus primarily is he seems to mess up and he made these like lines, who's in and who's out and what you do and what you don't do and how you do it. And so I think he gives us more guidelines, and that's how I tend to see it. And if you think of faith as a journey, and this is me, this is what's helpful for me. And maybe if it's helpful for you, great. If not, then chuck it. But if you picture a road, and there's two edges, right? And I picture love and justice kind of on both sides of that. And love, obviously, Jesus said the greatest command is love God, love your neighbor. And I think some people rightly interpret that as we reflect our love to God in loving each other and loving creation properly. And I think as we grow in that, we are on the right track. And also justice. And this is one I think it's important for us in America and the living in the empire that we live in to be reminded that we always need to be looking at the marginalized and the poor and listening to that as well. And so those two help guide us. I can't think of very many clear do's and don'ts. Is lying always wrong? That's a hard one. People disagree. Is it always wrong to kill somebody? What about self-defense? What about all? People disagree. And so I think for me, a lot of this it comes back to, I think the Bible is intended to be a conversation we enter in that begins to form us. In our small group a couple weeks ago, the leader read part of Rob Bell's book that said, we read the Bible and the Bible reads us. And meant to form us into the kind of people, so when we get into decisions, which are almost always gray or a spectrum, that we learn to make the best kinds of decisions that we can make. And so, again, I'm hesitant to say I just don't feel like there's a lot of do's or don'ts. Treat other people the way you want to be treated. Love God, love people, and that's what I got as we go through there. So, anything else to? Okay.
Oh, that's great.
We'll go to the next question then. Obviously, we cannot answer these in super depth, but this is the next question. Why did it take God so long to create humans? Did we evolve from primates? Where's the missing link between us and primates? I don't know why it took God so long to create humans, because I'm not God. But here's the thing. I grew up in a tradition that was very anti-evolutionist, and taught if you're going to take the Bible seriously, then you read it a certain way. And that's always how I read it. When I begin to realize more and more, well, science teaches something else, that is really hard to transition. Like thinking, oh, did we actually evolve from ape-like ancestors? That just was like, I can't grasp that. That's beyond anything, because I was always living in this certain bubble, this certain way of seeing. I think, my personal thoughts, there's an overwhelming amount of evidence that suggests an evolutionary process. We're not going to get into a lot of the fossils or the missing links. I'll give you a couple of resources. I mentioned this before. By the way, you can go online and watch this on YouTube later on as well. But BioLogos, BIOLOGOS.org, they have so much scholarship and science based as they interact with what does science say and how do we interpret the Bible. There's also a book written by Dennis Levereau or something like that, I Love Jesus and Accept Evolution, and he's actually more of a kind of conservative or moderate evangelical. Then there's another book written by Peter Enns, The Evolution of Adam. That helps, and he's got a great podcast, The Bible for Normal People. I'm not a scientist, and I actually trust the majority of science. So if the majority of science points in one direction, and they have fossils that seem to show an evolutionary flow, I accept that. I think science should inform our view and interpretation of Scripture, and not the other way around. If people disagree, it's not the core. Right? How we got here isn't the core. The thing I struggle with is that when it is a big deal to me when people put science against the Bible or say if you're going to be a Christian or take the Bible seriously, then you have to reject evolution. And that just, I've seen that harm so many people. Eventually they're going to go to college and they're going to see all this stuff and begin, okay, what do I accept? Faith that I was taught or handed, or evolution and what seems to be an overwhelming amount of scientific evidence. And again, I think that's an ongoing conversation. My closing thoughts, I actually think that this idea that God created through a very slow, long process is a beautiful thing. And that it reflects a God who doesn't coerce God's self on the world and say, now you're going to be this, but takes and molds and works with. And God's not in a hurry. And that reflects my own experience with how God interacts with me and how I've seen God interact with other people. It's a long, slow process, and I'm thankful, because I'm kind of slow, that God has a lot of patience and that God is working through that. So I'm going to hand it off, Angie, to Ed.
You know, Aaron answered this question so beautifully, and so I'll try to be brief in that I too was raised in a very anti-evolution and pro-creation theology home and church setting. So honestly, I hadn't looked into evolution much because I honestly, even my family and my church, we weren't even allowed to attend classes in school that taught about those things. It was like that doesn't exist. And so for me, I haven't looked deeply into it, and I see a lot of I will echo that. I see a lot of scientific proof for it. But if I am honest, the conversation, and I don't demean this question at all, I think this is really fascinating. The conversation for me personally isn't as interesting. But the reason why is, don't get me wrong, I ask myself all sorts of philosophical questions, like how did we get here? And if life, okay, if whether it's creation or evolution, if that was an evolving, what was before that? Was God here by God's self? Did God always exist? Sure, I ask myself all those questions. But I think what is, instead of holding tightly to those views of the beginning and how the universe was created, I can't answer those questions because it's a time when I was not physically present. And no one in this room was. So it's really hard for me, because of the type of person I am, to talk about something that I know very little of, And it's, again, not that I'm not interested. I think that I would like to suggest that maybe we are still in the state of evolution. That, think of who you were 10 years ago. Okay, now some people are going, wait, what does Angie mean by state of evolution? What I'm saying, not that you're going to become a fish next or something else. Think of who you were 10 years ago. I'm going to guess the person you were 10 years ago is not the person you are today. The person I was even a year ago isn't the person I am today. And I think this is not only on a spiritual level, but on a very physical, real level, right? We know that that every cell in our body, whether it's our epidermis, our hair, our skin cells, our heart, our bones, they all have parts of them that change. And they have their own changing cycle. And we become new creatures all the time. And I think with those changes, those processes, some take longer than others. And we're constantly forming and moving and evolving. And I'm not sure, if I'm very honest with you, how God created humans and how we became. But I will be very, very, very honest with you that I'm more interested in the conversation of who we are becoming. That is so important to me. I have no idea how we got here. What I care about more is who are we becoming as people. That I can hang my hat on, and that is something that I can fight for and pursue. So, next question.
Yep.
God, okay, so does God have a purpose for each of our lives? Does God speak to us? And if so, how? And can this include signs, circumstances, and other people? When someone suffers or faces a setback, is God punishing them for something they did or something another member of their family did, sometimes described as a generational curse? Wow, did I grow up with that phrase? Was it part of God's plan? Why do some really bad people not experience the kind of suffering that others do and even flourish? Wow.
Have fun.
Thank you, people, for asking these hard questions. Actually, these are all beautiful questions. There is no question that is not wonderful and insightful in some way. First things first, I want to tackle the suffering. Let's go there. When someone suffers, I have to just say, do I believe God is punishing someone for something they did? Absolutely not. So there's my hard answer. I will have a lot of not hard answers. This one I will have a very, no, I do not believe God that is punishing someone when they suffer. And as a matter of fact, I think this theology can be extremely damaging. Years ago, I was knee-deep in a music career and pursuing making that my life, and I experienced vocal damage. And I had a vocal hemorrhage. I couldn't sing, let alone speak, for a while. And it completely derailed my dreams of that. Right, and I haven't really shared this story much, I don't think, in one church, but it completely derailed my dreams. That's what I wanted to do. During this time, I tell you this for a very specific reason. During this time, a woman had decided that it was her best interest to come up to me and tell me that I was being punished, that it was me being judged for being gay. So because of being gay, God decided to take my voice. I was being punished. It's easy to have that type of theology until you're wearing the other shoe. And then it's like, ouch, this hurts. And I had this type of theology. I did. I had the type of theology that was like, look at your life, it's a mess, you need to repent. It's not until you're wearing, and I can't help but get a little bit emotional over this, it's not until you're wearing the other shoe that you go, this is so damaging to people. This is damaging to them, this does not bring life. And I believe Jesus taught nothing but bringing life and love. And this does not. And so this left me feeling damned, lost, and hopeless. The thing that's interesting is I also think this type of thinking echoes a very ancient worldview. A type of worldview that where we behave a certain way and we have to sacrifice to God in order to receive something. That was a very pagan way of living. That was a very ancient way of living. God, are you happy with me now? So when the story of Abraham and Isaac, when Abraham decided that this is what God called him to do, is sacrifice his son, we act like such shock and horror. That was a very common worldview then. And I don't think we understand that. To us, that's barbaric. It was very common to sacrifice in order to appease the gods. So you weren't receiving rain at that time and your crops were dying. Well, certainly the gods must be angry with me. So therefore, I will sacrifice my best livestock. God, are you happy now? Will you send rain? So would we receive rain then? Would God be happy then? If I'm no longer gay, will I be blessed then? If you abstain from a certain thing in life, will God be happy then? If I live just so, if I'm so good, if I do this, if I do that, if I do more, will God love me then? It's a very ancient way of being, and I will rest with this, that the topic of God speaking to us, I think, sort of ties right in with this. That in order, I think that God is speaking to us. For me personally, it's not an audible voice. I've heard some people say it is. For me personally, it's not. I think that God is in and all around us if we're paying attention. The problem is sometimes we're not fully aware, we're not listening, and we don't think we're worthy of that. Because we have spent our whole time offering sacrifices of, God, will you love me then? God, if I offer this cow to you, then are you happy? God, if I offer my life, my sexuality, my finances, my children, are you happy now? And instead, we're not sitting and resting in what God is speaking to us. And maybe he's been saying all along, I love you. I love you. And I think that if we listen, we truly will hear the divine all around us.
That's good. Zach, could you let us know when it's 10:02? We'll change that time a little bit. So the Bible is filled with stories of people where they heard God directed their life. And so part of the struggle with that is, how do we interpret the Bible again? These people were writing about these stories, reflecting, God told me to do this, God spoke and said this. I come from a charismatic tradition that there was a pressure in that you spoke these kinds of things if you were really spiritually mature. The Lord told me to say this to you. The Lord told me to do this. And now I think that makes me very trigger shy, because I've seen that the destructive side of that too, or the fact that I thought I've heard God and then later was like, oops, guess that wasn't. And so I say let's remain humble and very open to both of those. And how God speaks, I'm very open to songs, to lyrics, to other people, to driving in a car or something. And I attribute that to God or the Spirit often. I don't say that outright, but I'm very open. And somebody else might say, oh, that's your conscience, or that's you yourself. And that's all right. I think there's different ways. I think also we look at the Bible and it gives different ideas of why suffering happens. God caused the flood in the Noah story to judge the wicked. Sodom and Gomorrah, God sent fire. How do we interpret those? And then you have stories like Job, what contradicts what some people have called the retributive of evil, or the retributive where if you do the right thing, you will be blessed. And Job experiences the opposite. He's righteous and he's cursed, more or less. And so you wrestle with these things. I don't think it is black and white, but I think if we remain humble and open, we wrestle with those things. And again, I agree. I don't think God punishes us for that. I look at that then and I judge the Noah and Ark story and Sodom and Gomorrah as contextual, how they understood it at the time. And we've talked about that in the past, which not everybody agrees with. And I get that, but that's just part of it. So let's move on. We have a few more and some good ones that I definitely want to get at. So the next question, the majority, not that these all aren't good. Ooh, I did not say that. They're all good questions. So the majority of churches teach us of going to heaven when we die, yet the resurrection is very confusing. Some interpret as we are in limbo until the actual resurrection. Some preach of an instant placement in heaven, which is a safe assumption. I personally feel heaven is a state we can all currently live in if we allow ourselves. But I'm an optimist and always see the glass half full. I like you, person who wrote this question. I am an optimist and see the glass as half full. I tend to view heaven and hell primarily as states of consciousness that we can live into now. I think we see hell all around us when people are suffering. When we see people suffering from hurricanes, from poverty, from whatever it is, from violence, I call that hell. And so that's the first and foremost thing. When it comes to the afterlife, we're speculating. It's okay to speculate. It's okay to what happens when we die? Where do we go? How does that look? And Christian tradition disagrees. Some people say instantly you're in the presence of God, Or some people say there's a limbo period, or there's a purgatorial period, or some people say we all go to the same place until final judgment, and on that day, then we stand before a God and we'll all be judged, and then that judgment is forever. And there's all of these different things. I really don't know. So there's that. What I will say is what I experience of God as a God of love gives me a lot of hope for all people. And what that looks like, I'm not sure. But I feel like I can stand with integrity with somebody who is passing and have a lot of hope for what that looks like for them, no matter what their belief system may or may not consist of. And so I don't know what that means. I can't fathom a God of love that will send people to eternal conscious torment forever and ever. That just doesn't mesh with me.
Yeah, wow, that's a good one. We actually just talked about this the other day, that the concept of hell was actually one of the big things that sort of sent us on this pursuit of progressive theology, if you even want to call it that, if we want to have a label, because it's a tough one to wrestle with. It really is. I think, side note, a lot of these, we're not doing them full justice because we don't have enough time, right? But there's so much here, and I do think we'll further this discussion online, that hell, when you discover what people, how they viewed, Aaron's talked about this in great detail, and it's so helpful. When you discover how people viewed the world and what they thought hell was, people back then thought the earth was either a ball floating with, water in the sky, or people thought the world was flat for so long. There's so many ways people viewed the world that inspired the concept of hell, Dante's Inferno, a lot of different things. But I want to answer this question first. Raise your hand if you've ever died. Nobody? Come on. Anybody? You've never died. You were named after Dante's Inferno? That's what Dante wanted to say. Interesting. We'll talk about that later, Dante. Okay, so none of us have died. So is it safe to say that none of us are experts on death? I would also hang my hat on the same coat rack where my other hat is on with the creation and evolution story. I apparently have a lot of hats today. Same concept for me. We don't know. I love to talk and speculate, and I think these conversations are great. But if we're looking for hard yeses or no, I don't think we can find one here. I think actually our inability to answer very directly might irritate people more than than anything. But thank you guys for your patience. Okay, so let's move along. We're going to go kind of dive into a few different questions that kind of hinge around Old Testament or Hebrew scriptures and the New Testament. So the first question is, if Jesus followed the Old Testament, what about the Ten Commandments? 2, why is there such a huge discrepancy with how God is presented in the Old and in the New Testament? A wrathful God versus a God of mercy and love. 3, there are prophecies in the Old Testament about Jesus. It is said that Jesus has fulfilled every prophecy in the New Testament. What does one church say or think about this? Wow, so there's a lot to unpack here. And I am going to pass this off because the part, I talk about part of this later in our question and answer, and I really hinge more around the wrathful God and God of mercy or God of love. So I really want to pass off the Old Testament and Ten Commandments part to Aaron because he's worked up a really good answer for that.
So how about I'll jump in this, and then we'll jump down to the violence part?
Yes, I love that.
Because then we'll jump into the rapid fire ones.
Cool.
And we'll do it that way. First of all, Jesus was a Jew. So his Bible was the Hebrew scriptures. It was his whole entire life. He followed the Hebrew scriptures. Side note, it's interesting that there's a whole other separate religion that claims a separate religious person as its founder. So it's arguable whether Jesus ever imagined or wanted to create Christianity. I would tend to say no, but here we are. So Jesus clearly follows and engages with his scriptures, the Hebrew Bible. Matthew 5 is probably the clearest example of that. In the Message translation, Jesus says, "Don't suppose for a minute that I've come to demolish the scriptures, either God's law or prophets. I'm not here to demolish, but to complete. I'm going to put it together in a vast panorama. God's law is more real and lasting than the stars in the sky and the ground at your feet. Long after stars burn out and the earth wears out, God's law will be alive and working." And the way I interpret that and understand that, Jesus is saying, we're not just deleting everything, but I'm trying to embody what it means to live in this tension, especially when it's not just so black and white and legalistic. But these teachings, the Torah, sometimes translated as law, better translated as instructions, are meant to teach us how to be fully human. So we go to the Ten Commandments. Don't have any other gods before me. Don't make any graven images. You shall not take God's name in vain. Remember the Sabbath. Take a day of rest. Honor your father and mother. Do not kill. Do not commit adultery. Don't steal. Don't bear false witness. Don't cover your neighbor's house, wife, or possessions. Are those good things to live by today? I think so, absolutely. So, again, we look at that. When they were given after the Israelites left the Egyptian slavery, one way of seeing that is, now how do we be human? Well, here's 10 simple guidelines for your life on how you treat other people, how you be human now that you are free. That's actually how I read a lot of the Bible, the teachings of Jesus too. I don't think they're meant, oh my gosh, if you miss one of these, then God gets really, really angry at you. I like, by the way, there's an Eastern Orthodox tradition, and they teach that sin is separation or brokenness, and it's its own consequence. So when we sin or we mess up, that in itself, there's its own consequences that are there. I don't think God turns God's back or gets angry at us, but I think that has its own consequences when we act out in those ways, which I find beautiful. So jumping down, the Old Testament and the New Testament, something I've wrestled with a lot. I will say it does seem like God is more angry in the Old Testament than in the New, but God's not always angry in the Old Testament. One example is Exodus 34. The Lord is a compassionate and gracious God, slow to anger, abounding in love, faithfulness, maintaining love to thousands, and forgiving wickedness and rebellion and sin. So I love what Angie said a couple weeks ago. The Bible isn't violent so much as people were violent and how they understood God in those times. I think how I read Scripture is that people's view of God evolve and change over time. So we see that. I trump Jesus over other parts of Scripture, and how Jesus understood and saw God trumps how somebody else saw God. So I don't see a wrathful God. When it comes to reading those things, I think it helps for us. Some people have a flat view of the Bible. It's all equal. So if God said something in the Old Testament, then that really was God saying it. Does that make sense? And I would approach it and say, I think that was their interpretation of that at that time. Just like it's always our interpretation, but I look at Jesus and how he lived and focused on that. As far as, I'm trying to move through these quickly. Everybody still with us? Yes. All right. As far as the prophecies, I am extremely hesitant when it comes to Old Testament prophesying about Jesus for a couple of reasons. If you talk to a rabbi, they will say, quick to point out that most of these prophecies had to do in that context of that time. Different ways of reading the Bible. By the way, isn't it interesting, even though it's easy to point out that the Old Testament sometimes portrays God as wrathful, that's the Jewish Bible. The Jewish people have, in my opinion, not been near as violent as Christians throughout history. Side note, bunny trail. So here's one example of the Old Testament prophecy and how Christians sometimes have interpreted it and why I struggle with it. So Matthew 1:22 says, and this all took place to fulfill what had been spoken by the Lord through the prophet. Look, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and they shall call him Emmanuel. Most of us have heard this before, right? This is referring to a prophecy in Isaiah chapter 7. At that time, around the year 735 BCE, the prophet Isaiah is quoting or speaking for God to King Ahaz, who was facing two other kings that were going to come in and attack his kingdom, Judah, his kingdom. So the prophet speaking for God says, I will give you a sign. Basically, This is not going to happen. Don't stress about it. So Isaiah 7:14 and 16 says this: "The Lord himself will give you a sign. Look, the younger woman is with a child. You shall bear a son. You shall name him Emmanuel. He shall eat curds and honey by the time he knows how to refuse the evil and choose the good. For before the child knows how to refuse the evil and choose the good, the land before those whose two kings you are in dread will be deserted." The word here for young woman in the Greek, the Old Testament Greek Septuagint, is parthenos, which can mean virgin or old women. In the Hebrew, the word alma can mean virgin or young woman. Did I say old woman? Young woman. That's kind of important. Different detail there. And so, what is interesting is this was a specific prophecy given through Isaiah to a king that said there will be a woman, we don't know, it might have been his wife, that says there will be a woman that will conceive a son or a child. That child will be called Emmanuel. By the time that child reaches age 13, can discern good from bad, you will be at peace, and the land will be deserted. And so what Matthew did is he took this and reapplied it. Some scholars say that's horrible exegesis. You just can't do that. Well, Matthew did. And so Christians have and continue to ever since. Do I think some of the Old Testament may foreshadow Jesus? I'm very open to that. But I am very cautious when it comes to Jesus fulfilled these 300 prophecies of all, and this proves that Jesus was the Son of God. I think we take that first, and then we can perhaps see ways that points to Jesus. Hopefully that helps, and as fast as I could possibly say something like that. So let's skip down to the violence really quick.
Skip down to the violence. Okay. So let's go to the slide that says, how can we reconcile? It's the next one. We're going to skip the next section of questions and go to the one after that. That's it. Thank you, guys. How can we reconcile the justification to have the Israelites kill all the Canaanites at Jericho? I feel like this was more a story to teach something than a literal event. I can't justify that God would order the killing of innocent people. And 2, do you have any suggestions for how to deal with the parts of the Bible that talk about the wrath and judgment of God? I don't believe that those kinds of statements are true or accurately reflect the character of God. And I find myself reacting emotionally and negatively when I read those parts, yet I feel like it is somehow wrong to read only those parts of the Bible that are just easy for me and not those parts that challenge me. That's excellent. I feel like whoever asked that almost answered their question in a sense that it is true. I feel like we can't just skip over certain parts, and we want to, and I've done it many, many times. Oh, I don't like this part, skip, let's go on to something else. But I think it's valuable to find what is the value, what is the story in those parts of the Bible. So earlier we had the question that someone asked basically about the wrathful God versus a loving God. And I'd like to tackle that for a moment together if we can. That often it is told, as Aaron mentioned, that the God of the Hebrew Bible was angry and wrathful, right? I grew up thinking that way as well. Like the Old Testament's kind of irrelevant because now we have Jesus, so we have this New Testament. But then it's bizarre. Why don't we just have our own Bible called the New Testament and not have any of this other stuff, right? But we have this whole document, this whole entire book and library. So I think that and I get it, right? We have a God in the Old Testament that we see that is always needing to be appeased, a God that's always judging, who's always commanding what sounds like to kill. He's always exiling people. And then you read the New Testament, and it sounds very starkly different on first read. You now have writings and about Jesus' teachings and his teachings of love and grace and inclusion, and how he wants to change the world and give us life. And it's laced with all sorts of altruism and guidance. And you're like, okay, wait a minute, but just this whole first section sounded really gory and bloody and what's going on. But I do agree that I think if you take a deeper look, you'll see that there's themes in both. There is very much violence in the New Testament. And if you don't agree, I actually think the killing of Jesus is really violent, extremely violent. That's a horrific story that I wrestle with myself. That is extremely violent. You also have really wonderful, beautiful stories of God doing things in different ways in the Old Testament. And they're stories of love, deliverance, and hope. But I think the thing that's interesting is the Hebrew Bible actually makes up almost 3/4 of the Bible. So to discount them and, like that person said, read only the parts that are easy for me would mean you're only stuck with 1/4 of the Bible. So then what's the point of even reading the thing, right? Which some of us are asking that, actually. I also want to say that's okay to ask that. What's the point of reading this thing? That's actually why we're doing this study, is to say, what does this book mean to me? What does it mean for those people then? Why is it so important? Are there things I can learn from them? And we have to understand that these teachings we can't discard them based on the idea that God may have been represented as wrathful, because we have to keep in mind, as we've said a million times, that humans wrote this book. Humans wrote these narratives. So in Exodus 21, verse 24, we read a scripture that some of you may have heard: an eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, hand for a hand, foot for a foot. And that pretty much sums up the violence. Like, you stab me, I'm going to stab you. Very violent. And we go, what? How can this be okay to command, if you poke my eye out, I'm going to do the same? When I don't resound with that. I resound with peace and love and guidance. And it seems barbaric and horrific at first glance. And then we read, well, believe it or not, as crazy as this sounds, this actually was an act of mercy. I know that sounds weird, but it was a time when if you poked my eye out, I would kill you and kill your family and probably go to war against your country. It wasn't so simple. So this was sort of a way of setting up guidelines of, hey, like, let's basically back it up a little bit. And I know we can't relate. We don't live in that culture. But the Romans established a code of conduct during this time, not just in biblical scripture, but in history. In 455 BC or so, they wrote this code of conduct called the Laws of the 12 Tables, and they talk about this, ways that we should live. And it's ways that seem so horrific and barbaric, yet you look at the time and you go, it was insane. Like, I'm talking violent, like Game of Thrones violent. And if you watch that, you know what I'm talking about, insanely violent. That was their time. So these stories you read is sort of this, again, the word evolution, this evolution of humanity. They're wrestling with their own violence and their own anger, and in it finding ways to have mercy and grace, which is bizarre. And then there's some that don't quite make sense. And I think that that's okay. And I think that's why we have these discussions to wrestle with and go, what did that mean to you? How do you perceive that? Now, all of that being said, when I read the peaceful teachings of Jesus, I personally cannot support violence in any way. I, too, agree with that person. I cannot justify that God would order the killing of innocent people. And that's kind of where I rest on that. Now, do we want to enter the rapid fire? Or
Okay.
what do you have? Oh, yeah, you have a lot to
Here's
say.
what I have a suggestion we do. It's after 11. So we have lots of questions to go. So I think this is going to be a to be continued.
Okay, perfect.
And we'll come back to this in 2 or 3 weeks. We'll figure out when we can both be here and when we can both do this. But here's a little taste of some of the other questions that we'll be wrestling with in a little bit. What is the historical validity of the Bible? Do we have any proof it happened? What about other sacred texts? How do we understand or relate to that? Revelations is so confusing. By the way, it is for me too. Why does anybody view the Bible as the ultimate authority? Why did God kill Jesus? Did Jesus have to die? What about the resurrection? How do we understand that? So, those are biggies. And if we try to even remotely tackle them in like 2 minutes, it's just not going to work. So I think we'll save that for another time, and we'll give some closing remarks if you want to kind of say something as we...
Sure. No, I think that's wise to pause there, because we do have a section we call the rapid fire question, so we can just pew, pew, answer off all these questions quickly. But the thing is, some of these I know are questions you guys have deeply wrestled with. And I feel like if you've deeply wrestled with it, it really does warrant some heartfelt conversation and thoughts. And so I know in this place there are people that wonder a lot of things. Some of your questions aren't even shown here today. I think that what I would like to say personally is that this place, if you haven't gathered that already, is a place for you to be, to rest. It's a safe place. It's a safe place for you to ask these questions and dig deeper. And a lot of times we were given answers, most of us. We were raised with a certain set of answers in theology. And sometimes, and I've said this before, but sometimes we have these ideas of the way things should be, and life comes alongside and disrupts that. You can't help but change your mind and your theology. Because when you're taught one thing, but life gives you a whole other set of circumstances, you go, what now? I have this feeling in my heart, there's a lot of people in this room that are probably here because of that. If not, I have a hard time imagining that you would want to stick around in a place that really wrestles with questions and doubts. It's probably because you have a lot of questions and doubts. And if you don't have questions and doubts, maybe you know people that do, or maybe you just don't see things going the way it was told it should be. So down pat with certainty. And it's terrifying, and so I want to be very gentle and sensitive with some of you that might be embarking on this journey of some people call it deconstruction. You can label it whatever you want, but it feels sort of like someone just pulled out the rug from underneath you. You were so steady and so sure, and all of a sudden you have no idea what end is up, and it's frightening. It can be very frightening. And so you go, well, what do I do with that? I have 20-something years of my life, or 30-something years of my life, or 50-something years of my life in this theology, and now what? And I encourage you in this moment not to necessarily even throw anything away. Don't even feel like we're saying you have to believe what we believe and throw it all away. I think what we would like, what I would like, what this community would like, is to grow deeper in our understanding, deeper in our connection with God, with each other, and to maybe not get so wrapped up in some of these things that have derailed us along the way, but instead find that love and message that Jesus is talking about. I could add more, but I will stop for the sake of time. But I am personally available to talk about this as well. I also want to say that for me, my answers aren't really answers, they're responses. And I think that's how this should be. There's no one authority. I think we should have responses to each other. And just as much as I've shared and Aaron's shared, I would love to hear your responses. Please don't think we're talking at you. I would love it to be a dialogue.
A few parting words. I've been really drawn more recently. I don't know a lot about the Eastern Orthodox tradition and their beliefs, but one of their central belief is that the spiritual life, the journey, is about theosis, or union with God, and that everything else flows out of that. And that union, or that intimacy, or connection to the source, to God, to love, however you want to describe that, cannot be accessed through our mind alone. And what I think has happened a lot in the Western world is we've almost navigated faith to our mental, cognitive belief systems, if we check off a bunch of these beliefs. And I think it's just falling apart for so many people. And we have thousands of Protestant denominations. And what I think has happened a lot of times is, no, this is what happened after you die. No, this is what happens after you die. No, this is how we came to be. No, and we grab on all of these different doctrines, and pretty soon they become so important. And then somebody else disagrees with one little thing, and they go start something else. And I think really what we're exemplifying is most of these things we really don't know. And so we hold most of our beliefs very open. And what we come back to time and time again here is that we're trying our best to follow the way of Jesus. And I think Jesus is teaching a way of transformation, a way that we are formed as people. Love is the guide towards that. So I want to invite the worship team to come back up here and end with that 1 Corinthians. And it was somebody had it in a question, actually. And this is interesting because I've never thought about it in quite this way, but it's really simplistic, where the author says these three things remain: faith, hope, love. All of them very important. But the greatest of these is love. If God is love, the essence of everything is love. And we wrestle with what that looks like. And that's okay to do. And that's okay to wrestle with how our beliefs impact that. But it's about formation. Information by itself doesn't just necessarily lead to transformation. And we've missed that, I think. And it's fallen apart for so many people. What if I disagree about this? What if I understand it differently? And that's okay. We're on a path and on a journey. And I think the most important thing is how we treat other people. That's the fruit that we exhibit from others. So, sorry we had to cut it short. Hopefully some of these that we left out there unanswered will bring people back as we wrestle and continue to wrestle with these questions.